I wanted to say something about matter in Thomas Aquinas, which is what I'm working in, or it's related to a project that I've kind of transitioning through. And but I know that this audience in particular knows so much about matter. So so I hope what I say will be in some way interesting, and maybe you can fill in things for me that that I'm missing on the historical side. Good. So the doctrine that matter considered in itself is without all form is probably one of the best known features of the metaphysics of Thomas Aquinas, as is the corollary to the view that each substance has only one substantial form. But it's difficult, to say the least, to imagine or conceive of a substrate of change which is itself without form or actuality. So difficult, in fact, that attempts to make sense of the view have sometimes merely explained it away. And towards the end of my talk, I'm going to come to a couple of views that try to make sense of Aquinas' doctrine of prime matter that end up really making it something other than what it is. But I think it's because of just the difficulty in explaining it that it's kind of easy to shipwreck. So what I want to do today is call attention to what I think is a helpful problematic regarding the way that bodies act on other bodies. And I think that this problematic is helpful because it drives Aquinas to think of matter the way he does. It's not a problematic that's original with him, but it's a helpful way to sort of get yourself motivated to understand his theory, right? And if we think of matter as the solution to this kind of problem about how bodies act on one another, we have access to a way of making sense of the view of completely formless prime matter and the idea that matter in itself is a potency, not a potency principle, but is the very potency of body. And I think it's so I want to start with the problematic, move into explain sort of how matter is the solution to it, and then deal with a couple of problems that I think this way of approaching it solves. That's the game plan. So section 1 is this idea of matter as ultimate receiver and underlying potency. Like many of his contemporaries, Aquinas is committed to the view that action always flows downward from what is higher and more noble to what is lower and less noble. And I think this is familiar to people who work in this historical mode. And so just, I won't spend time motivating the view, but for convenience I'll call it the hierarchy of causality thesis. And the difficulty with this thesis is that it seems to render lateral action impossible. It seems impossible that one body should act on another because how are they hierarchically related? To clarify the challenge that lateral action poses, I want to introduce briefly one seemingly obvious way out of the problem, which doesn't get introduced as a solution in Aquinas, and then I want to look at the way it's problematized in Aquinas. It may seem like the obvious way out of the problem to just say, well, I'll arrange the corporeal world in some kind of hierarchical arrangement too. And I'll say that, when one thing acts on another, it's because it's superior to the other. And there's some evidence that all bodies are arranged hierarchically, even for Aquinas. I think that probably is the case. Right? For example, fire is the most noble of the elements, right? Because it's the most active. But Aquinas doesn't use that belief that he has to get him out of this problem of lateral interaction. He's got that belief on the table, but it doesn't solve the problem. And the reason it doesn't solve the problem is because it's a deeper version of what I'm calling the problem of lateral action, which is not just that bodies need to be hierarchically arranged, but that, in fact, bodies seem to be able to act mutually on each other. So even if you had a kind of the whole world in some sort of hierarchical system, and where a dog is sort of more noble than a rock, the problem is that, yes, the dog can act on the rock, but also the rock can bonk the dog on the head, right? So the fact that the dog sort of outranks the rock ontologically doesn't help him solve this problem. And so I think this sharpens the challenge of lateral causality. The problem is not just that the lower acts on the higher, but that two things seem to act on each other. despite their rank. So people took the hierarchy of causality thesis so strongly that they were motivated to deny action to body altogether, and to kind of some theories of occasionalism. Now I'm going to focus my analysis of how Aquinas deals with this on his Summa Theologiae text in Summa Theologiae 1:15, Article 1, but also Sentences book. He's got a treatment of this is in the second book of the Sentences, and a really nice long treatment in Summa Contra Gentiles 369, which I'll mention a little bit. So the objectors, and I like the Summa Theologiae text because he names some of the people that he's dealing with. The objectors in that text deny that all bodies are active, and the idea that they kind of share. I think there's three objections. They share that this idea that bodies are merely receivers of spiritual action. So they say that fire cannot heat wood. When wood becomes hot, some spiritual substance is the cause. Actually, there's two versions of this in the object. One version says that bodies can't act at all, and the other one says that bodies can't bring forth substantial form. So there's a kind of restricted version of the thesis and a broader version of the thesis. But I'll sort of treat them together for now, unless it becomes necessary to deal with one or the other. The stronger view is the one that Aquinas attributes to Abba-Severon, your favorite guy, Nicola, who he thinks denies all action to bodies. And he attributes the weaker version to Plato and to Avicenna. And according to Aquinas' interpretation, Plato and Avicenna hold that body is the cause of substantial change, that bodies aren't the cause of substantial change, but do serve as disposing causes somehow. Right. All right. So now, both the stronger and the weaker version of the view preserve the causal hierarchy thesis without running afoul of the problem of lateral causality, because they say that the action just always goes from higher to lower. In fact, bodies play a significant role, even though they're not active, for these occasionalists, because they need some theoretical lowest principle of motion that is just acted upon and is not acting at all. And they say, well, that's what bodies are. That's what, without some lowest grade of being that is only acted upon or not acting, the universe wouldn't be complete. And so in the first objection, and this is again Summa Theologiae 1:15:1, the objector appeals to Augustine to distinguish three levels of agency, the first one belonging to God, the second to spiritual beings, and the third to bodies. God acts and is not acted upon. Spiritual beings both act and are acted upon, and bodies are acted upon but do not act. And then bodies are this sort of passive counterpart to God's pure act, since they are moved and do not move. And according to the second objection, the second objection kind of strengthens the first one. And the second objection says that it's not mere fittingness that there requires a lowest grade of being, but that an absurdity would result if some such being didn't exist. And I think this made it on your hand. Well, maybe I think I put the response in your handout, but in the objection it runs like this. Quote, everything that acts, excluding the first agent, requires a subject for its operation which is susceptible to its action. But below corporeal substance, there is not a substance which is susceptible of its action, for this substance has the lowest grade among things. Therefore, bodily substance is not active, end quote. Okay. So the idea in sum is just you need to prevent this infinite regress of susceptibility things, and so you need some ultimate susceptibility principle, and this is body. And Aquinas thinks that this just contradicts experience. To deny that bodies both act on and are acted on another is to just undermine the phenomena that we see in front of us. But he's really surprisingly accommodating, or what maybe surprised me at the time, the first time I encountered it, accommodating to his occasionalist objectors. He admits the narrow point that in the Augustinian hierarchy, corporeal beings occupy the lowest place. But he distinguishes between the causal rank of bodies taken severally and the causal rank of bodies considered as a whole. And And he responds, and I think this is text 2 in your handout. To the first objection, it should be said that the passage from Augustine should be understood to be about corporeal nature taken as a whole, which does not have some lower nature under it on which it acts, but as spiritual nature acts on bodies and the uncreated nature acts on the created. But nevertheless, one body is inferior to another insofar as it is in potency to that which the other has in act. End quote. So Aquinas is sort of using the mechanism of act and potency in order to explain the directional character of action that is assumed in the hierarchy of causality thesis. Being up or over indicates actuality here, and being down or under indicates potentiality. And one body is higher than another insofar as the first body has the actuality to which the second body is in potency. So if you step back and you consider bodies as a whole, the world of bodies does indeed occupy the lowest place in the scale of beings, but it turns out that this lowest grade of body is split into two metaphysically, into an active dimension and a passive or receptive dimension. So this is his solution to the objection against bodily agency, and it rides on admitting part of the dialectic, right? Which is that there's some lowest genus, but that the lowest thing is not the whole genus of bodies, but a potency principle. And this potency principle, of course, is what Aquinas identifies with prime matter. So it's important, I think, to think of prime matter as necessary. And I'm going to sort of use this as a placeholder here, and I'm going to flesh this out as we go on through some of the problematic in the talk. But the motivation for prime matter, or one motivation, is as receptive subject that allows this lowest rank of being to exist as receiving, or allows for the rank of being above it to act on it. And in fact, it allows for the lowest rank of being to have members which act on each other. It allows for lateral causality. So I'll sum up with text 3 on your handout, where he kind of gives this view. He says, "It is not necessary then that every body be lacking in action merely because in the order of things corporeal substance is the lowest according to its genus. For among bodies one is superior to the other, and more formal and more active, as fire is with respect to lower bodies. Nor is even the lowest body excluded from acting. For it is clear that body is not able to act by its whole self, since it is composed of matter, which is being in potency, and of form, which is an act. For indeed, each thing acts insofar as it is an act. And on account of this, every body acts according to its form, which is related to another body, namely the patient, which is a subject on account of its matter, insofar as its matter is in potency to the form of the agent." And I just want to make a couple of remarks in this text. In some ways it summarizes what I already said, but I think there's two new points here that are worth flagging. One point is that here matter seems to be identified with the very potency of bodies. There's a little bit of an ambiguity. Some people that I talk to want to say that matter is a principle of potency and not potency for Aquinas. And I think what you can say is that matter is the potency that a body has, and it has it in virtue of its matter. A text that didn't make it on your handout that I have a text, if you want to talk about it in the Q&A, from the sentences. Aquinas says that materia est sua potentia, and he seems really has strong language about this. And the other point, the other, I guess, reason to think of matter as the very potency is that it's the counterpart to divine actuality. So at least symmetrically, it plays that role in the system. And so the fact that Aquinas is making that comparison also seems to indicate that we should think of matter as the potency of body. Okay. Now, the text doesn't quite say that every body can act on every other body, but he does say that even the lowest body can act. So it's interesting to think metaphysically how wide he wants to allow bodily agency to go. There's cases in which a receiver isn't suitable to receive the action of some other particular body. But I think that's maybe because in cases like that there's an impediment, right? So at least metaphysically, I think the most natural way to think about it is that because of this shared potency, every body can act on every other body, or bodies become suitable receivers for the action of all other bodies. And we could think about ways in which Aquinas would want to handle bodies that don't seem to affect each other when they're put into contact or something, and whether he would say that that's actually the case or not. But in any case, if we look at the response to the first objection, he brings up Aviceveron again, and I think it's another indication that matter should be conceived of as potency. And I'll read this text and then we'll go on to some of the problematics. So he says, quote, "And through this, the solution to the second objection is also clear." This is like the first and the second objection actually come together. He answers them in a single objection here. "It should nevertheless be known that whenever Severin argues thus, there is something that is a mover and not moved, namely the first maker of things. Therefore, from the opposite, there is something moved and only being affected, patiens tantum, this should be conceded. But this is prime matter, which is pure potency, just as God is pure act. A body, however, is composed from potency and act, and therefore is agent and patient." Okay. All right. So just to wrap up then, the problem of lateral causality explains how mutual action is possible because every body is divided into form and matter. All right, so if matter is a potency, I should say I want to move on to section 2 to kind of some of the problematics here. If matter is a potency, then like all potency, matter has to be defined by the form or the actuality towards which it is ordered. And the most important feature of a material reception is that the forms gained and lost in such a reception have to be contraries. And I'll put that statement out there, but it's going to need some qualification. But basically it works like this. When a body receives a form in virtue of its matter, the agent inducing the form does so by a form that's contrary to the one currently possessed by the patient. The idea is that agents which act on matter must always be somehow contrary to the patient, and thus the material patients must have bodies constituted of contraries. And he's in Contra Gentiles 255, he says it is contraries that mutually expel one another. And on account of this, it is necessary that everything which is corrupted per se must either have contraries or be composed out of contraries, end quote. So contrariety is presupposed in the structure of the kind of action that I think is proper to bodies. And because of that, whatever corrupts another has to be contrary to that which it corrupts. And contrariety is proper to bodies insofar as they're general and corruptible. But even though that's true, there's an important qualification to be made. It isn't the substances as wholes which are contrary to one another, but rather the active and passive qualities through which they act. The contraries that are the active qualities which serve as instruments of the substances. And so in De Sensu et Sensato, he gives a kind of nice, clear version of the difference between the way that the active principles have to be contrary to each other, but the substantial forms don't. And he says the following, quote, "Things are naturally suited to act and be affected by each other because they have contrariety, as is shown in the first book on generation. But to fire insofar as it is fire, and to earth insofar as it is earth, there is nothing contrary. And the same is true for any other substance. Whence it remains that such bodies do not act and are not affected insofar as they are fire or earth or any other such thing, but only insofar as they are hot and cold and moist and dry," end quote. So there's a difference between the kinds of forms in virtue of, or the kinds of forms which inform prime matter, which are substantial forms, and the kinds of forms which are the active principles to which prime matter makes something susceptible, which are the contraries. You might roughly think of this as sort of a metaphysical order versus a physical order. But prime matter plays this important role in both ways. Now we could talk in the Q&A if you want about how Aquinas' prime matter differs from other potencies, and I have in mind intellectual potency and of course the matter of the heavenly bodies. And I think it centers around this notion of contrariety. There's not contrariety in either of those cases, and the heavenly body case is especially interesting because there is kind of locomotion that, you know, and this whole discussion with Philoponus about whether it's contrariety or not. But anyway, but the point here is just that the set of actualities and the kind of change to which prime matter makes something ordered is the one where the active principles are contraries. Right. So I think with this picture in mind of prime matter as the potency of body, and as a potency by which body is open to the actions of contraries, I think we have the resources to deal with something that frustrates a lot of interpreters of Aquinas, which is his idea that prime matter is numerically one. And again, I think using this problematic to get into the notion of prime matter, I think will help us make sense of why he wants to claim that prime matter is numerically one. I also, so in this section I'm going to talk about the numerical unity of prime matter, and in the next section I'm going to kind of build on that and say that by conceiving of prime matter in this way as a potency, it's going to help further clarify the relationship between matter under some form, like bronze, and the further form that actualizes it, like Hermes, and the relationship between prime matter and formed matter. But we'll talk about that in the next section. All right. So one way to deal with the numerical unity of prime matter, and I think the most straightforward and best way, is just to say that prime matter is not divided among the many bodies which share in it. It is neither individuated nor spread out. It is indifferent to all division, quantification, and difference, because all those things are formal and posterior to matter. And I think this just makes sense, but I've noticed people being hesitant to read prime matter this way. And in print, I think the most common move to make is to point to Aquinas' qualification in the De Principiis Naturae that prime matter is not numerically the one in the way that things having some single form are numerically one, but it's only numerically one in some other sense because it's got nothing by which it can be distinguished, from any other thing. There's no sort of, right, there's unity in a way implies division from something else, and there's nothing by which it can be divided. And that's true, he makes this distinction, but I don't think that undermines the broader construal of that I want to give, that matter is just simply one and shared among substances, even though the substances that share it are divided from each other. I think there's a tendency, so in print they just point to that distinction, and I think there's a corresponding tendency in conversation to want to say something like prime matter is similar or the same in kind among all substances, and they want to back down from the kind of hardcore implications of numerical unity, and I don't think we should back down from that. And in fact, so in addition to this De Principiis passage, I think there's an even stronger text from the Meteorology where he doesn't use the language of numerical unity, but he does say that, quote, all bodies share in one prime matter, which is their subject, and into which, as into something ultimate, they are resolved, end quote. So it's really this kind of common subject nature. So how do we make sense of a numerically one subject shared by all bodies if the bodies themselves aren't numerically one? Well, I don't think this is a problem if we consider matter as a potency indifferently related to all the actualities that can be brought about by the contrary qualities. When Aquinas insists that bodies share in one common matter, he's considering matter just in itself, rather than as the matter of this or that thing. and matter considered insofar as it is actualized by some form cannot be a potency for the form which already actualizes it. So this is obvious if I consider fire as a potency, right? Or fire insofar as it has a potency. Fire's matter is in potency to become earth, air, water, dog, iron, etc. Every sublunary thing other than fire. So fire is thus the only thing excluded from the list that it's in potency to, because the prime matter potency for fire has already been actualized by fire. But fire is matter just insofar as it is matter. If you sort of exclude the fact that it's already being informed by fire, is the potency for all corporeal actualities, including fire. And because all potencies, including matter, are defined by the actualities towards which they are ordered, any given matter stands in potency to the form of all those things of which it is the common matter, as Aquinas says in Summa Theologiae 166. So matter is the shared potency for all bodies, shared by all bodies. And anything actualizing this potency must determine it in some way which excludes the various other possibilities. And thus, any existing body excludes many things contrary to itself. But considered in itself, matter is open to all body. This is, I think, going to give me the tools to think about how formed matter works, right? And how the stuff that we usually call matter works, right? Like bronze or something. And I want to say that bronze is the matter for X, let's say for a key. And the for X, really, all the work that's making it the for X is being done by some form that's restricting the range of potency towards which matter. So I'm really trying to distinguish the susceptibility, receptivity, or the sort of indifferent tendency to become all things on the one hand, from the specified tendency, or from the specification of that tendency through form. And if matter is really only identified with the former, if that's the strict notion of matter, I don't think you have a problem with numerical unity, right? Because as soon as you get exclusion or division or anything like that, you're already on the side of form. So I think the point of texts such as Materiality 1.3, in which Aquinas claims that prime matter is a common subject for all bodies, is just that bodies are indifferently open to the action of other bodies because they all share in the common subject. And it's a really nice text, and I want to use the example in it, so I'm going to read it to you. It says, quote, "Therefore Aristotle says that fire and air and water and earth," and I think this is on text 6 in your handout, "come to be out of one another, even though Empedocles thought the opposite. And this summarizes the proof in the second book of Generation and Corruption. And the reason he gives is that each of the elements is in the other potentially, in potentia, and that things related in this way are able to be generated from one another. The other reason he gives is that they all share in one prime matter, which is their subject and into which, as into something ultimate, they are resolved. For all those things of which matter is one in common are related such that one thing is in potency to the other, just as a knife is potentially in a key and a key in a knife, for iron is the common matter to both of them." End quote. So what matter contributes in the system of bodies is this feature of everything being in everything else in potentia. And were this not the case, certain bodies would be cut off from the receiving the actions of other bodies, and the material world would not be a system open to mutual causality. There'd be no system of physical causality, to use more modern terms. Instead, however, Aquinas says, a little bit later on in the same text, that the entirety of bodily nature which is below the circularly moved body is like a certain matter existing in potency to heat, cold, moisture, and dryness, and to the other passions and forms which follow upon these. End quote. So there's a kind of proportion between the active powers of body and matter. And it's because of the metaphysics of prime matter, and because prime matter is sort of in metaphysics the counterpart to substantial form, it's easy to miss that it, in this analysis in physics, there's a kind of correlation between the active powers of body, the heat, the cold, the moist, and the dry, and matter is that which brings something forth from matter, that's what's responsible for educing matter. So these accidental forms are correspond to matter in physics the way maybe substantial form does in metaphysics. So before concluding, I want to just remark on two recent trends on the topic of prime matter that I take to be problematic, both of which result, I think, from not construing matter as the very potency of body. And the one trend is to construe matter as subtly containing some actuality, and the other is to take it to be nothing at all. And I think my construal of prime matter as a potency for transmutation via the contrary qualities sheds light on the positive role that prime matter is intended to play despite its status as a pure potency. The first of the two trends just mentioned, and this is my interpretation of this trend, but you'll see I think it's a reasonable interpretation, is to attribute some sort of basic actuality to prime matter. And I think a recent prominent proponent of this view is Jeff Brouwer, who's a friend of mine, very good scholar of Aquinas, but I have this kind of disagreement with him about his construal of matter. And he imports this kind of analytic language of gunk. He talks about prime matter as atomless gunk. And he thinks it's something composed of indefinitely many smaller sums of matter. And one justification he offers for this view is that matter is supposed to be that which persists through change, and prime matter persists through all the change. And so for that reason, it's got to be something re-identifiable, right? It's got to, and so he wants it to be possible to talk about the matter that was formerly X's matter, but is now Y's matter. And to illustrate that point, he compares the matter involved in substantial change to a classic case of accidental change in which a bronze statue is melted into rings. Just as the bronze in the rings is identifiable as the same bronze that was in the statue, so must something in the substantial change be re-identifiable. And so, of course, it's not going to be something with a lot of properties, but you're going to have some chunk of matter that's the same. And I won't get into all the details, but I think basically this kind of view imports some kind of quantity, right, into the matter. I'll kind of summarize this because I don't want to go on too long about it, but I think that's the effect of this kind of atomless gunk view. And I think the move to make it palatable, because you know that Aquinas wants formless prime matter, is to just discount this quantity as actuality. It just doesn't really count somehow. It's like minimal enough that I can kind of throw it under the bus, right? But I think that as soon as you introduce any kind of diversity, you imply parts and divisibility, and divisibility implies quantity, and then you're kind of stuck with actuality, right? So the other direction that you could go, right, is to say, well, then maybe prime matter is nothing at all, right? And it's, at least dialectically, this seems to be the view that Robert Pasnow flirts with. You know, if Brouwer is attributing some actuality, Pasnow is playing with this claim that prime matter has no actuality. He asks rhetorically at one point in his book, he says, how can that which in itself is not just unknowable, but even nothing, be an important part of any philosophical analysis? Yet if prime matter is not nothing, then is that not to say that it is a thing of such and such a sort, and therefore actual? And he doesn't quite go so far as to attribute actuality to it, but he never really resolves this dialectic that he sets up, right? And I think both of these views have this, well, I mean, if you were to take Pasnow's view and, you know, kind of think about it as though he came out and said that it's either nothing or actuality, if you take that dichotomy seriously, I think the problem is generated by not considering ends and potentia to really be ends, right? Which I admit is difficult conceptually, but that's the move that Aquinas wants us to make, right? But of course, for Aquinas, material substances can't just be composed of their acts of existence and form and then nothing else, right? Beings that are so composed are angels, and angels differ not only specifically from cats and dogs, but also in their metaphysical composition. And so I think these two opposite interpretive tendencies, what they have in common is the struggle to explain how anything non-actual can account for any real aspect of being. And they point to, I think, an important difficulty in arriving at the concept of matter. Ultimately, both the tendency to struggle actuality into prime matter and to interpret it as nothing resulted from approaching prime matter in a certain way, namely by stripping some composite substance of its formal attributes to reach some fundamental substrate, right? You do this kind of mental stripping exercise. You take away the top layer and you go down to the next layer. And I think this is a necessary way of getting to matter, but it's also very dangerous or sort of delicate exercise. And the question when you're doing it is sort of, as you're removing layers, what are you looking for underneath, right? So you might say the matter of the brazen statue is the bronze, within which we can once again distinguish form and matter, etc., right? And this is, of course, the process you have to go because, as you all know, Aquinas thinks that matter is knowable not in itself, but through analogy to form, which, of course, you have this wonderful working group that tells me all the history of this concept for 1,000 years. So, but like I said, then the question, how is this analogy to form supposed to work, right? And I think we need a guide for the analogy. And I think Aquinas gives us some clues as to how that guide is supposed to work. So if we think back to the problem of that lateral causality and how I think this highlights the distinction between the explanatory roles of form and matter. And I want to return one more time to one of the answers he gave against the objection against bodily action, against these occasionalists. But this time I want to turn to the Contra Gentiles text, 369, where he says, quote, "It is not necessary then that every body be lacking in action merely because in the order of things corporeal substance is the lowest according to its genus. For among bodies one is superior to another, and the more formal and more active, as fire is with respect to lower bodies. Nor is even the lowest body excluded from acting. For it is clear that body is not able to act by its whole self, since it is composed of matter, which is being and potency, and of form, which is act. For indeed everything acts insofar as it is an act. And on account of this, everybody acts according to its form, to which is related another body, namely the patient, which is the subject on account of its matter, insofar as its matter is in potency to the form of the agent. If, however, the opposite is the case, and the matter of the acting body be in potency to the form of the body of the patient, there will be mutual acting and receiving, just as happens in the case of two elemental bodies. But if only one of them is acting, the other is merely a patient with respect to it, as is the relation of a heavenly body to the bodies of the elements. Thus, therefore, a body acting acts on a subject not by reason of the whole body, but by reason of the form through which it acts." End quote. So here the roles of form and matter are cleanly distinguished. Form contributes the active principles of change, while matter contributes the susceptibility. And it's nice also that you get this idea of reciprocity of action in the sublunary world. You don't get one-way action when bodies down here act on each other. You do when the heavenly bodies act downwards, but not in this case, right? Because contact is always mutual, right? As before, matter on this account doesn't contribute undifferentiated or generic potency, but only a potency of a certain sort, potency to the contraries. And specifically to the set of actualities that are contraries, which exclude one another. Because the roles of form and matter are so distinguished, I would argue that the stripping process only succeeds in elucidating what prime matter is if we pay attention to the potency at each level down rather than the actuality, to the susceptibility. Again, it's not undifferentiated susceptibility. You can say stuff about it, maybe not very much, but you can say something about it. You can distinguish it from other potencies, right? And so my proposal is that, I think the view becomes clear if we reconsider the example case of the key and the knife that was introduced in the meteorology text, where he says that the knife is potentially in the key and the knife for the iron is the common matter of both of them. If we consider the example carefully, there turns out to be an important ambiguity in the question, wherein lies the potency for the iron to become a key? One possible reply is that the iron is hard, meltable by fire, solid at room temperature, and another answer is that iron is composed of matter. Each in reality answers a different question. If you ask, why can the iron become a key rather than a basketball? The appropriate answer is the list of key-conducive actualities that make iron a good candidate for a locksmith to use. But if you ask, why can the iron become a key rather than remain the same? Then the answer is that as a material being, it is constituted so as to receive a new form at the expense of its current one, which is to say, one of its constituents is prime matter. Strictly speaking then, if we keep the roles of form and matter sufficiently distinct, it is wrong to hold that the reason that the knife and the key have the same matter is that both of them have iron as their matter. What is instead true, or at least if that's true, it's only true in a qualified way, but what's really the better thing to say is that the knife and the key have the same matter insofar as iron can become either of them. The matter signifies the ability to become, right? At least when it's considered strictly as matter. The what it can become is this result of this composition at the lower level. So the commonality of the matter in the knife and the key rests on the potency rather than the actuality. That's the move that I want to make. And iron is the shared matter of the key and the knife, not only insofar as it is iron, but insofar as it is matter. Okay. So I think if we cash out the example in terms of a contemporary understanding, we see that it's possible to mistakenly think of the iron as a substratum of the knife and the key, and then to think of some molecular structure as a substratum of the iron, and then some atomic structure as the substratum of that, and so on and so on and so on, without ever really considering the potency. You could do this whole stripping exercise and never get to a potency, right? So you have to go into the exercise knowing what you're looking for. And if you strip away actualities to get more fundamental substrata, it's easy to consider the substratum only in terms of its actualities, in terms of the features and properties of the next level down, and never make that metaphysical move that allows you to get to matter in the first place. And if you do that, the ultimate substratum is going to seem like a disappointment. If you implicitly assume that the whole explanatory value of considering each successively lower level lies in the actual features by which the lower level is conducive to the higher level, like the hardness of the iron being suitable for the requirements of the knife, then you're really targeting actuality rather than potency. Have I really ended up with anything different? Well, I think the way to make sense of matter then the way not to make sense of matter is as essentially rooted in some potency. I think we have to think of matter as it's not capable of independent existence, but at least capable of independent explanation. It's sort of metaphysically its own principle, and we can't try to understand it as being derivative of some actuality. And I think that this view of this sort of dialectic that Brouwer and Pasnow get themselves into, where the struggle is that they're trying to assimilate this potency to the model of an actuality. Just to end, then I want to say, well, does this say something only about prime matter, or does this tell us something about matter in general? And I think this gives us this heuristic that I've suggested about how to do the stripping process. I think is supposed to, in the first instance, tell us about prime matter. But then I think that this tells us that this is the potency principle that's referred to in the definition, or implicit in the definition of matter in general. So that even if we talk about bronze as matter, there's a receptivity principle that we have to be including in our definition. Not just the active tendencies of bronze to become, say, sharp because it's hard, but also the possibility of losing some form and acquiring some form through the loss of another form, acquiring a second form through the loss of the first one, the kind of process of a transmutatio, of an exchange. And that's built into the very structure of physical change in Aquinas' analysis. and that you need a metaphysical principle to account for that. You need this remote principle to be there. But it only makes sense once you have this view of causality as kind of outflow from form. Once you have that, you really need receptivity to be another principle in the universe, because actuality can't do that by itself. There's nothing in it by which it could ever be receptive. So the difference between prime matter and what sometimes gets called proximate matter then lies really in the scope of the potency, not in the nature of the matter itself, right? Prime matter is common to all substantial forms, where matter under some form is restricted to a potency to only some forms. So anyway, that's what I wanted to show you. It's really this kind of heuristic or way into the problem of prime matter that I think is helpful, and I hope that some of the fact that Aquinas is engaging with some of these people by name, might be interesting, and I want to see how this connects with your own discussions about matter that you've been having all semester long.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed.